Welcome everyone, Monica Medina here. We're thrilled today to have with us Tiernan Sittenfeld, who is the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the League of Conservation Voters, and she's been one busy lady up until now. So we're thrilled to be able to talk with her today about what's happened in 2020 and what's going to happen in 2021, we hope. Tiernan, let's just jump in. The pandemic was sort of a huge barrier to a lot of other news in 2020, and obviously because it was so tragic, because it's been such a hard thing for so many people. But it did sort of block out conservation news and climate news, but not entirely. So I would be interested in your perspective on that. And what are your takeaways from trying to compete with the pandemic during the election cycle in 2020?
And well, before I answer that question, thanks to you both for having me. It's great to get to talk to you. I'm a huge fan of yours and of Our Daily Planet. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And, I would say that voters and people in this country understand that 2020 has been absolutely horrific, from the pandemic to the economic crisis and economic inequality to racial injustice to the climate crisis. And they get that all of these crises are interwoven and that the solutions and the opportunities to recover our economy, or as the president-elect Joe Biden says, build back better in a way that is just and equitable, that there's huge opportunity there. And I do give a lot of credit to Vice President or President-elect.
I know, we trip over it all the time.
Harris, yes, it's still hard to get used to that, but so exciting. But I give them a lot of credit for the way that they campaigned. In terms of your question of, even with all of the pandemic and all of the crises and racial injustice, that the climate continued to break through. And I think that was partly a reflection, again, of voters just get how interwoven this is, but also the fact that President-elect Biden leaned in so much on the interwoven nature of these crises. And he also campaigned more on climate than any presidential nominee in history. Of course, we all worked together to really elevate climate as a top priority in the Democratic presidential primary. I think we were really pleased with the results of that, where we had all of the top candidates putting out not just sort of perfunctory climate plans, but really strong, ambitious climate plans. There was the great forum that you all did with MSNBC. There was the CNN town hall. So there was so much attention to climate in the primary. And then we saw candidate Biden only continue to get stronger in terms of his commitment to climate solutions, to climate justice, to environmental justice. And the Build Back Better plan that they came out with in July was extremely exciting. We're very excited about those commitments. So now we have the president-elect who ran the most on climate, put out the strongest plan we've ever seen from a presidential nominee, won on climate. During the transition is continuing to really focus on it. We're seeing all of this great conversation and prioritization of them taking an all of government approach when it comes to the climate crisis, whether on national security, led by John Kerry, or the National Economic Council, led by longtime climate expert Brian Deese.
So, yes, isn't he on your board? Or he was?
He has been on our board, yes. I'm assuming he's getting off soon, but yes.
You'll be hearing from him.
Yes, after he did incredible work for the Obama-Biden administration on climate and conservation and public lands and oceans, came onto our board, he's been great. But we're really excited for him to be leading the charge on the National Economic Council. So I think this whole of government approach is part of long-winded way of getting back to your question of how climate has continued to break through, because it's not a siloed issue or niche issue. It really touches absolutely everything, as you all know so well and talk about so compellingly yourselves.
This past election was really a big one for political ads. And, from the Lincoln Project to other groups, we just saw these really hard-hitting ads. And I remember, sitting watching TV and seeing an LCV ad that was about oil companies owning lawmakers. And I was like, whoa, that just really gets to the heart of it. So I wanted to ask, how much money did LCV spend on the presidential election, congressional races, down ballot? And can you tell us a bit more about the types of ads you put out, maybe what was most successful and resonated with voters?
Well, thank you for noticing that ad. And thank you for asking for people who haven't seen it, really calling out big oil and fossil fuel companies for their decades of lies and misinformation and deception, and really doing such a grave disservice to the American people and to our planet. And I think that message really resonated with people. And as we talked about, there's so many crises right now, but people see that they're connected. And so we were really proud in this being our most ambitious electoral cycle ever, because clearly the stakes for everything have never been higher. So we spent a record-breaking, for us, $115 million.
Wow, $115 million.
I should note, we are all for campaign finance reform, but we also have to operate by the system as it exists, not as we wish that it were today. But clearly, we do need to get big polluter money out of politics. And we've always known we would never be able to outspend the fossil fuel industry. But what we needed was to spend enough money to be able to effectively communicate our message, because we know that we have things like science and facts on our side, and we have the support of the American people because we're looking out for their interests, the public interest, for public health, for the environment. It included a massive presidential program that was aimed at persuading swing voters on the environment. We also raised an unprecedented amount of money through givegreen.com, which we're currently raising money with all eyes on Georgia to help Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff win those two very important seats. We also played a significant role in a number of Senate races, in House races, in gubernatorial races. And we were really excited to do our work differently this year and to partner with other organizations like Black PAC in Michigan to help elect Gary Peters, as one example. We do our raising with organizations like NRDC Action Fund and Next Gen America. We were, again, excited about the volume of our work and the efficacy and the fact that climate really did break through, not just in our ads, but in the ads that candidates, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, ran and won on.
Yeah, the Biden campaign did do a climate ad. It was great. And it was about farmers. They did 5. They did several.
Yes.
Really exciting to see. So you talked about accountability and how well you all do, not just lifting up the good guys, but also showing who's had a bad record on climate and environment. You do this list called the Dirty Dozen, and then there's Trump. So talk about that list and the effectiveness of a list like that, particularly in today's world of social media. And then where does Trump fit? Can he even, does he need a whole new scale?
So, right. So to start with Trump, this cycle, LCV Victory Fund named him literally the dirtiest of all time. Obviously, I mean, he's the worst president we've ever had across the board.
By far.
Including when it comes to the climate crisis, to the environment, and to public health. And then he was joined by 12 other, I would say, pro-polluter villains, both at the state level and the local level. And then we had another 12 at the federal level. We were really happy, not just that Trump lost, but that people like Martha McSally in Arizona was defeated. And now we already have champion Mark Kelly in this already, which is really great. We also were excited that Cory Gardner lost, and John Hickenlooper is a strong, longtime environmentalist and proponent of clean energy. I mentioned Gary Peters. We had his opponent on the Dirty Dozen as well, John James. So definitely the Dirty Dozen is long been a program where we target the candidates regardless of their party affiliation. And I should note that in the past, there have been many Republicans who we've been able to support. This time there was literally only one in the entire Congress. His name is Brian Fitzpatrick from the Philadelphia area, who really is a strong environmentalist. But unfortunately, I think with the Koch brothers and with Citizens United, we've just seen the polluter stronghold on the Republican Party writ large get stronger and stronger, and more Republicans led by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy be more and more radical and extreme and out of touch with what the people in this country want.
That's a really interesting point you made, but really unfortunate. But I did want to ask, because I don't think that even all Republican voters necessarily subscribe to how Republicans on Capitol Hill act and vote toward the environment. When we were starting to get into this election, there was a lot of speculation. Monica and I wrote about it. Will this finally be the climate election? And I think that's a complicated answer. I don't think there was an overwhelming mandate, but I do think that voters are more attuned to climate issues than ever before. What did LCV learn about who is a climate voter in 2020, and what kinds of groups are amenable to the message? Who cares about these issues now?
Right. All great questions. And your attention to this is extremely important. I mean, first of all, I would say the overwhelming majority of people in this country are climate voters. At least 2/3 of people who voted for Biden in the Democratic Senate and the House candidates called climate an important issue for their vote. So clearly it's especially important for young people, because this is literally their future on the line. I two boys. I think they're not old enough to vote yet, but certainly this is front and center for them. They think about, and I think about as their mom, what kind of world are we leaving to them? But also we see for young people across party lines. So young Republicans also care far more than older Republicans. And then definitely Black, Indigenous, and people of color across this country made a critical difference in very important states. And we have seen, like, you can't have climate justice without environmental justice, without racial justice. Again, it's all so interwoven. The role that, again, that BIPOC communities played in this election and their concern about these issues can't be overstated. Overall, I would say, really, I mean, even there was an exit poll that was on Fox News on election day that like at least 2/3 of voters across the board are extremely concerned and more likely to support candidates who support common sense, clean energy, and climate solutions.
Yeah, we've just been really struck by the polling, and it does cut across party lines, it cuts across demographic lines, it cuts across racial lines. It seems like the public is overwhelmingly in support of these issues. But to make progress going forward, given the makeup of the new Congress, we're going to have to persuade more than just one Republican. So what do you guys think? What's the path forward that will help bring more Republicans over into the LCV camp, keep them, moving towards progress on all these?
Right. If you look back to our bedrock environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of them, they were passed by overwhelming bipartisan. Mostly in the 70s, signed into law, in many cases by a Republican president. These issues didn't used to be so partisan. And we need to get back to being able to legislate in a bipartisan fashion. And it's not that we became more ambitious or extreme, it's that the Republican Party, again, in cahoots with the fossil fuel industry and led by extremists like Mitch McConnell, became so much more out of touch and radical and extreme themselves. And so I am heartened by some of the progress that we've seen in a bipartisan fashion at the state level in places like South Carolina, where they passed overwhelmingly a bipartisan solar bill into law with major Republican support. The Republican governor of Idaho has talked about clean energy and climate action. In some states, there's a bit less of a partisanship. There's more of a willingness on the part of Republicans to come to the table. I do hope that we will see, especially as there are more younger Republican members of Congress, perhaps some of them will be our parents who are thinking about their children, or if they're not concerned about the climate crisis first and foremost, they might be concerned about the economy. They might want to create clean energy jobs. They might want to save consumers on their energy bill. So there are so many advantages or solutions to the climate crisis that are win-win-win. So again, this is something that is really vexing. And it is so stunning that as we've seen the horrific impacts of the climate crisis unfolding across the country and the globe, whether it's the record and just sickening, awful forest fires in California or the flooding or the more severe storms. So the fact that any Republican would feel like it's appropriate to continue to stand in the way of climate progress is really appalling. But again, back to the polling, I think it's also clear they're doing so at their political peril at this point.
Hopefully voters begin to hold their elected officials accountable more and more, because, we saw this past summer that the entire West Coast was choking on smoke for about 2.5-3 months, 30 named storms. So I think it's undeniable. And I hope that voters continue to hold lawmakers' feet to the fire.
And we know you'll help them do that.
We will with our National Environmental Scorecard, which people can see online. We keep track in real time on how members of Congress are voting on key issues on climate, clean air, clean water, public lands, democracy related issues, because obviously our climate and our democracy are quite related. And then definitely, I think whether it's writing letters to the editor or making phone calls or certainly at the ballot box, we absolutely do need to hold elected officials accountable and figure out, are they standing with us and our future and our planet, or are they standing with polluters?
Well, Tiernan, thank you so much. And for everyone watching and listening, make sure to check out LCV scorecards. They're really important. Get to know how your lawmakers vote on these issues and what their score is. So thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today. It was really informative, and we hope to have you back soon.
I'd love that. Thank you both so much for having me.